Comrades, you wake each morning believing you understand the world you inhabit. You believe your choices are your own, your struggles are personal misfortunes, your poverty a matter of fate. But I tell you this, your reality has been engineered by forces you never see, forces that feed on your labor, distort your consciousness, and shape society according to their own interests. What you call normal life is nothing more than the architecture of domination, built by a ruling class that depends on your blindness to maintain its power. You are not merely workers. You are the creators of all wealth, the foundation of all industry, the living engine of society. Yet you stand alienated from the very world you build. The products of your hands become the property of another. The hours of your life evaporate into profit for those who do not labor. This is no accident. This is the design of capitalism, the system that thrives by extracting your energy while convincing you that its chains are natural and eternal. Look deeper, and you will see what the ruling class works tirelessly to conceal: the concentration of capital in the hand of the few, the commodification of every human capacity, the transformation of life itself into an object of exchange. From the ideas that circulate in the press, to the institutions that claim neutrality, to the values. You are taught from childhood everything is shaped to protect the interests of the dominant class. This is not conspiracy. This is the logic of a system whose survival depends on controlling both the material conditions of life and the consciousness of those who sustain it. Yet capitalism's power is never absolute. It trembles before a single truth: the working class, once awakened, possesses the capacity to reshape history itself. When workers recognize their shared condition, when they see their exploitation not as isolated suffering but as collective injustice, the entire edifice of domination begins to crack. The ruling class fears this awakening. They fear your unity. They fear your clarity. They fear the moment you understand that the wealth of the world is not theirs, but yours. Every crisis, economic collapse, unemployment, inflation reveals the system's inherent contradiction. Capitalism cannot exist without exploitation. It cannot thrive without inequality. It cannot expand without sacrificing the well-being of the many to enrich the few. These crises are not failures of the system, they are expressions of its true nature. And so you must ask yourselves, how much longer will you allow others to define your reality? How much longer will you permit your labor to be extracted, your potential suffocated, your future mortgaged for the benefit of a parasitic elite? History is shaped by struggle, not the quiet acceptance of misery, but the conscious, organized action of people who refuse to remain invisible. When workers unite, when they challenge the economic structures that dominate them, when they dare to imagine a world governed not by profit but by human need, then, and only then, does the possibility of genuine freedom emerge. Comrades, the forces shaping your reality may be hidden, but they are not invincible. The moment you illuminate them, the moment you grasp the workings of class power, the moment you see yourself not as isolated individuals, but as a collective power, you become dangerous to the old order. This is your call to consciousness, your call to solidarity, your call to action grounded in the knowledge that another world is not only possible, it is necessary. Do not accept the world as it is presented to you. Question it, analyze it, organize against it. For the future belongs not to those who exploit, but to those who produce. And when the working class rises with clarity and unity, the forces that once shaped their reality in secrecy will be confronted by a power they cannot contain, a people who have discovered their strength and refuse to surrender it. Comrades, the time to awaken is now. Capitalist power shapes reality by controlling both material conditions and human consciousness in ways so pervasive and deeply rooted that most people pass through their entire lives without even recognizing the mechanisms that define their existence. In a capitalist society, ownership of the means of production grants a small minority control over the material foundations of life, the factories, the land, the machines, the technology, the infrastructure. These material conditions determine what is produced, how it is produced, who works, who profits, and who must struggle merely to survive. When one class monopolizes these foundations, it is not merely controlling economic resources, it is structuring the entire social order. Every aspect of life becomes subordinated to the imperatives of profit and accumulation, transforming human relations into economic transactions and reducing individuals to units of labor or consumers in a vast machinery of extraction. But the dominance of capital extends far beyond physical resources. It penetrates the realm of consciousness, molding perceptions, beliefs, and desires so that the existing order appears natural, inevitable, even just. By controlling the institutions that mediate knowledge, schools, media, culture, entertainment, and the political apparatus, the ruling class shapes the ideological horizon in which people think. It defines what is considered possible, what is considered normal, what is considered acceptable. This ideological power is more subtle and insidious than any physical force because it operates beneath awareness, creating a worldview in which exploitation is disguised as opportunity. Inequality is reframed as personal failure and systemic. Domination is hidden behind narratives of meritocracy and individual freedom. People internalize these narratives and come to believe that the hardships they face are the result of personal shortcomings rather than structural conditions imposed upon them. Material control and ideological control reinforce one another. Workers depend on wages to live, yet the conditions of their employment are shaped by forces entirely outside their control. They must accept whatever work is available, however precarious or dehumanizing, because their survival depends on selling their labor. This creates a psychological dependency that capitalism exploits, making workers feel fortunate simply to have employment in a system that exploits them by design. Meanwhile, ideological institutions teach them to see work not as a relationship of coercion but as a moral duty, a path to dignity, a sign of individual worth. The result is a population that participates in its own subjugation, believing that the structures that harm them are natural expressions of human society rather than artificial constructions serving the interests of a minority. Capitalist control of reality manifests in everyday life in ways so normalized that they often escape notice. Advertising shapes desires by manufacturing needs that did not previously exist, turning consumption into a substitute for fulfillment and identity. News media frame social issues in ways that obscure class relations, focusing on sensational events and individual scandals while neglecting the systemic causes rooted in capital's dominance. Education systems prepare individuals to function within existing economic structures rather than question them, teaching obedience to hierarchy and conformity to the demands of the labor market. Political discourse is confined to narrow boundaries that exclude any fundamental critique of private ownership and exploitation, ensuring that the population debates superficial differences while the foundations of power remain untouched. Even the rhythms of daily life become governed by capitalist imperatives. Time is measured in wages, productivity, and deadlines, and people internalize the belief that their value is tied to their economic output. Creativity, community, and human solidarity are eroded as individuals are pushed to compete against one another for opportunities deliberately kept scarce. In this environment, social fragmentation is not accidental. It serves the interest of capital by preventing collective awareness and collective resistance. As long as people perceive one another as rivals rather than comrades in a shared struggle, the ruling class maintains its power with minimal effort. Capitalism's control over consciousness is most evident in the way it obscures its own mechanisms. It teaches people to view capitalism not as a historical phase with specific relations of power, but as the natural state of human affairs. By shaping the imagination itself, capitalism prevents people from conceiving alternatives, making inequality appear inevitable and collective liberation unimaginable. When the oppressed cannot envision a different world, they become resigned to the one imposed on them, allowing the system to perpetuate itself, even as it deepens their exploitation and alienation. Workers create all wealth, yet remain alienated from its benefits, because the very structure of the capitalist system is built upon the extraction of labor while denying workers control over the products, processes, and purposes of their own activity. Every object produced, every service delivered, every machine operated, every building constructed, every form of value that circulates through society originates from the physical and intellectual labor of workers. Without their daily effort, no industry would function, no capital would accumulate, no society could sustain itself. Yet, despite being the creators of all material wealth, workers find themselves excluded from the prosperity they generate. The wealth they produce is appropriated by those who own the means of production, while the workers receive only a fraction of the value they create in the form of wages that barely cover their subsistence. This contradiction lies at the heart of alienation. Workers are separated from the products of their labor because what they create is not theirs. The commodities they produce appear to them as foreign objects belonging to someone else, embodying value that they cannot touch. Their labor becomes a mere transaction, a necessity for survival rather than an expression of their human capacities. They produce goods they cannot afford, contribute to profits they never see, and build enterprises whose success only increases the power of those who exploit them. The worker's creativity and effort materialize in forms that enrich the capitalist, while the worker remains locked in a cycle of labor and deprivation. This alienation extends beyond the products of labor. It infects the labor process itself. Under capitalism, work is not a voluntary, self-directed activity but an imposed necessity. Workers do not control the pace, purpose, or conditions of their labor. Instead, they are subordinated to machines, schedules, supervisors, and corporate demands designed solely to maximize profit. The labor process becomes a source of exhaustion rather than fulfillment, a drain of energy rather than a realization of human potential. As labor becomes fragmented, repetitive, and dictated by external force, workers lose connection to their own abilities and creative powers. They feel like instruments rather than autonomous beings, performing tasks without understanding their purpose or impact, reduced to extensions of the machinery they operate. Alienation also manifests in the loss of communal ties, because workers are forced to compete with one another for employment, promotion, and survival. Capitalism dissolves solidarity and replaces it with rivalry. Instead of recognizing their shared condition as exploited producers, workers are encouraged to view each other as obstacles or threats. This division serves the ruling class, for a fragmented working class cannot challenge the power of capital. The potential for collective strength is weakened by the daily pressures of competition, insecurity, and fear of unemployment. Alienation thus becomes not only an economic condition but a social one, eroding human relationships and creating isolation in the very spaces where unity is most needed. Perhaps the deepest form of alienation is the estrangement of workers from their own human nature. Labor, when free, is an expression of creativity, skill, and purpose. It is the means by which humans transform the world and themselves. But under capitalism, labor becomes coerced, reduced to a means of earning wages rather than a meaningful expression of life. Workers sell their time, which is to say they sell a portion of their very existence. Their capacities become commodities, valued only for their profitability rather than their humanity. This transformation of labor into a market commodity distorts the workers' relationship to themselves as they internalize the belief that their worth is determined not by who they are, but by how much value they can produce for someone else. The alienation persists because the wealth generated by workers is used to reinforce the system that exploits them. Profits are reinvested not to improve workers' lives, but to expand capitalist enterprise, automate labor, suppress wages, and strengthen the power of owners. The worker thus becomes the architect of their own subordination, building the economic structures that perpetuate inequality. Every hour worked, every product created, every service delivered adds to the wealth of the ruling class, deepening the gulf between those who labor and those who profit. Even when productivity rises and wealth multiplies, workers remain trapped in a state of scarcity because the benefits of progress are captured by the few. Technological advancements that could liberate humanity from toil instead become tools for intensifying exploitation. Instead of reducing work hours, increasing wages, or improving living conditions, innovations are used to maximize profits and discipline labor. The result is a world where abundance is possible yet deprivation persists, where workers generate immense wealth yet experience insecurity, debt, and exhaustion. Workers remain alienated from their collective power as well. though they produce the entire material foundation of society. They often fail to recognize the immense force they hold when organized. This alienation from their potential as a class reinforces the power of capital, preventing workers from asserting the rightful claim to the wealth they create. The ruling class maintains its dominance not only by controlling material resources, but by shaping consciousness so that workers accept their deprivation as natural. Thus, workers create all wealth but live in conditions of alienation because the system is structured to ensure that the fruits of their labor flow upward while they are left with the bare minimum needed to survive, separate from their work, from each other, and from their own human essence. The ruling class maintains dominance through hidden economic and ideological forces by structuring society in ways that keep their power invisible yet absolute, operating behind the facade of freedom, choice, and neutrality. Their control begins with ownership of the means of production for whoever owns the factories, the land, the technology, the banks, and the networks of global exchange controls not only economic life but the very conditions under which everyone else must struggle to survive. This economic dominance is not presented as domination. Instead, it is disguised as the natural order of things, as if some people are simply meant to own and others are meant to work. The ruling class uses its property to dictate wages, define labor conditions, and set the boundaries of economic possibility for the rest of society, all while claiming that the market is impartial and self-regulating. In reality, so-called free market is engineered to guarantee their advantage through laws, regulation, and institutions carefully crafted to protect capital and weaken the working class. Beyond economic control, the ruling class exerts ideological power that is even more subtle and effective. They influence the beliefs, values, and perceptions of the population through their dominance of media, education, culture, and political discourse. Newspapers, television networks, film studios, social platforms, and publishing houses are overwhelmingly owned or shaped by those who benefit from the existing system. As a result, the public receives a worldview that aligns with ruling class interests, the glorification of wealth, the normalization of inequality, the framing of poverty as a personal failing, and the constant reinforcement of the idea that capitalism is the only viable economic system. People absorb these messages without realizing they are being conditioned, which is precisely why ideological control is so powerful. It makes domination seem voluntary. Education functions as another ideological weapon, shaping attitudes from childhood. Schools teach obedience to authority, competitiveness, and the acceptance of hierarchy. Students are rewarded not for critical thinking but for conformity, punctuality, and the ability to perform tasks dictated by others. History is sanitized to portray ruling class interests as synonymous with national progress, while struggles of workers and oppressed groups are minimized or erased. By the time young people enter the workforce, they have already internalized the logic of the system. Work hard, obey, compete, and never question why power is concentrated in the hands of a few. This ideological training ensures that economic domination is rarely challenged at its roots. The political system is another arena in which ruling class power remains concealed yet decisive. Although political parties and elections are presented as expressions of popular will, the reality is that the wealthy shape policy long before votes are cast. They fund campaigns, lobby lawmakers, and influence legislation through think tanks and policy institutions. The result is a political landscape where meaningful change is nearly impossible because all major parties operate within limits set by capital. Debates focus on surface-level issues while ignoring the fundamental question of who owns the economy. Thus, even when the working class votes, its choices are confined within boundaries that preserve the power of the ruling class. The ruling class also uses ideological narratives to divide the working class, preventing unity that could threaten their dominance. They promote nationalism, racism, sectarianism, and other forms of identity conflict to keep workers isolated and suspicious of one another. Instead of recognizing their shared exploitation, workers are encouraged to blame immigrants, minorities, or other marginalized groups for their hardships. This fragmentation ensures that the ruling class remains untouched while the oppressed fight among themselves. Division is not accidental but a strategic necessity for maintaining power, and it is reinforced constantly through media, politics, and cultural discourse. Even the concept of freedom is manipulated. People are told they are free because they can choose between products, careers, or political candidates. Yet all these choices exist within a framework controlled by capital. Workers are free to sell their labor to any employer, but they are not free to avoid selling their labor altogether. They are free to vote, but not free to decide whether wealth should be privately owned or collectively controlled. This illusion of freedom masks the reality of structural coercion, making workers believe they participate in shaping their own lives, even as their conditions are dictated from above. The ruling class maintains dominance by ensuring that its power appears diffuse, impersonal, and inevitable. They do not rule through visible force, but through the quiet mechanisms of economic dependency and ideological shaping. Most people never see the strings that pull their daily lives because the system teaches them not to look. Through these hidden forces, the ruling class sustains a social order in which they reap the benefits of collective labor, while the majority endures insecurity, exploitation, and alienation, never realizing that the world they live in was constructed to keep them subordinate. True liberation begins when workers recognize their shared exploitation and unite, because only through collective awareness and solidarity can the power of the ruling class be confronted and overturned. Under capitalism, workers are deliberately kept isolated, fragmented, and unaware of the common conditions that bind them. Each individual is encouraged to see their suffering as personal rather than structural, to believe that their struggles with low wages, long hours, insecurity, and lack of control are unique burdens or failures rather than symptoms of a systemic design. This isolation prevents workers from seeing the immense strength they possess when acting together. Yet beneath the surface, every worker lives the same reality. They sell their labor to survive, they produce wealth that others appropriate, and they face the constant pressure of exploitation that grows more intense with each passing generation. When workers begin to recognize that their hardships are not isolated events but part of a shared, class-based condition, the first cracks in the system's ideological armor appear. Awareness transforms the individual experience of exploitation into a collective understanding of oppression. Workers start to see that unemployment, stagnant wages, rising costs, and worsening conditions are not random misfortunes, but deliberate outcomes of a system that relies on their vulnerability to maintain profits. This recognition breaks the myth that capitalism benefits everyone. It exposes the reality that a small minority prospers precisely because the majority is exploited. Only through this clarity do workers begin to understand that the struggle is not against isolated employers or temporary circumstances, but against an entire economic structure designed to subordinate them. Unity emerges when this shared awareness becomes consciousness of collective power. Workers realize they create all value and that without their labor, society would grind to a halt. The ruling class depends on workers far more than workers depend on the ruling class. This truth is concealed by ideological narratives that portray workers as replaceable and powerless. But once workers understand their true role, they begin to recognize that they are the backbone of all production, all wealth, all progress. When the working class sees itself not as scattered individuals but as a unified force, the balance of power shifts fundamentally. Solidarity becomes a weapon more powerful than any tool of domination used by capital because it undermines the ruling class's greatest advantage, division. Unity is not merely a feeling, it is an organized, conscious force built through collective struggle. Workers learn that individual resistance is easily crushed, but collective action strikes. Unions, coordinated demand, mass mobilizations can disrupt the flow of profit and expose the vulnerability of the capitalist system. When workers withdraw their labor, they reveal the dependence of the ruling class on those they exploit. This realization strengthens their resolve and deepens their understanding of the system's fragility. Even the smallest act of solidarity becomes a step toward liberation, because every moment of cooperation breaks down the ideological barriers that capitalism has spent centuries constructing. As workers unite, they begin to develop a vision of an alternative society based on human need rather than profit. True liberation is not simply the easing of economic burdens, but the transformation of social relations. Workers imagine workplaces where decisions are made democratically rather than dictated from above, where technological progress benefits all rather than enriching the few, where time is no longer dominated by endless labor but reclaimed for creativity, community, and human development. This vision grows as workers struggle together, as they discover their capacity for collective decision-making, mutual support, and shared purpose. Liberation becomes conceivable not as a distant utopia but as a practical possibility rooted in the real power of the working class. Recognition and unity also dismantle the psychological chains that bind workers. Capitalism not only exploits labor but shapes consciousness to make exploitation seem inevitable. When workers unite, they shed the internalized beliefs that kept them obedient, the belief that they are weak, that they deserve their suffering, that nothing can change. Through struggle, they recover a sense of dignity and agency. They begin to see themselves not as victims, but as historical actors capable of reshaping society. Liberation thus begins not only in the material realm, but in the realm of thought. When workers cease to accept the world as it is, and begin to imagine what it could be. The ruling class fears nothing more than this awakening because it threatens the foundation of their power. Unity exposes the system's lies, disrupts its operations, and reveals that its dominance persists only because workers remain divided. Once the working class recognizes its collective strength, the ruling class can no longer rely on fear, scarcity, or competition to maintain control. The social order becomes vulnerable to transformation from below. True liberation begins not with reforms granted by those in power, but with the self-organization of workers who understand that freedom cannot be given. It must be taken through collective struggle. Thus, liberation is born from the moment workers understand their shared exploitation and unite around their common interests. This unity transforms scattered grievances into a force capable of overturning the structures of domination. It is through solidarity, collective action, and conscious struggle that the working class moves from isolation to empowerment, from resignation to resistance, and from exploitation to the possibility of a new society founded on justice, equality, and human dignity. Organized collective action is the only path to transforming society because the power of the ruling class is too deeply entrenched, too structurally protected, and too ideologically reinforced to be challenged by isolated individuals acting alone. Capitalism is not simply a set of economic relationships, it is a system woven in every institution, every norm, every law, and every perception of daily life. It survives not because it is just or efficient, but because it is defended by a network of political, cultural, and economic mechanisms designed to neutralize opposition. Individual acts of resistance, no matter how courageous, are easily dismissed, suppressed, or absorbed by the system. Only when the working class acts together with shared purpose and organized strength can it confront the structures that reproduce exploitation and inequality. Collective action becomes the means through which the many challenge the power of the few. Workers acting collectively can disrupt the very heart of capitalism, the continuous flow of profit. Every factory, office, warehouse, field, and network operates only because workers make it function. When workers organize and act together, they demonstrate their indispensable role in society. Strikes, walkouts, coordinated slowdowns, and mass mobilizations expose the dependency of capital on labor. They transform the worker from a passive participant into an active force capable of shaping the terms of production. This transformation does not occur spontaneously. It arises from organization, planning, and solidarity built through shared struggle. Collective action forces the ruling class to recognize that workers are not merely units of labor, but a conscious class capable of asserting its interests. Organization also protects workers from retaliation. Without collective structures, unions, councils, committees, movements, individuals, workers risk being punished, fired, or isolated for resisting exploitation. The ruling class relies on this fear to maintain order, but when workers act together, they can shield one another, making it far more difficult for employers or institutions to suppress dissent. Collective action replaces isolation with mutual defense, giving workers the courage to confront injustices that would be overwhelming if faced alone. Solidarity becomes both a shield and a weapon, enabling workers to sustain long-term struggles rather than brief moments of resistance. Moreover, organized collective action creates democratic spaces where workers develop political consciousness and leadership. In these spaces, they debate, strategize, and learn from one another, discovering their shared interests and identifying the roots of their oppression. Through this process, workers cultivate the skills needed to govern society themselves. They learn to make collective decisions, resolve conflicts, distribute responsibilities, and articulate demands. These forms of organization become prefigurations of the society they aim to build. Societies where decisions are made collectively and human needs guide production. The development of class consciousness through organized struggle is essential because transformation requires not only material power, but also ideological clarity and purpose. Collective action also builds momentum. Each victory, no matter how small, demonstrates the potential for change and inspires broader participation. Workers who once doubted their power begin to see that their action can produce results. This growing confidence strengthens the movement, attracting more people and expanding its capacity. As organizations grow, they become capable of addressing larger structural issues, moving from workplace struggle to challenges against political institutions, social inequalities, and the underlying foundations of capitalism. Transformation becomes a cumulative process driven by the increasing unity and determination of the working class. The ruling class is acutely aware of the threat posed by organized collective action, which is why it invests enormous resources in preventing workers from organizing, anti-union laws, propaganda against collective movements, surveillance, division by race, nationality, or religion, and economic insecurity all serve to weaken the potential for unity. The fact that capitalism must constantly resist organization is proof of how dangerous collective action is to its survival. If individuals working together were not a threat, capitalists would not fear it. The very intensity of their opposition reveals the power that organized workers hold. In moments of collective uprising, history shows that the seemingly unshakable structures of domination can crumble with astonishing speed. Systems that appeared eternal collapsed when workers, peasants, and oppressed communities united in disciplined, organized movements. These struggles demonstrate that the power of the ruling class is not natural or invincible. It is sustained only by the passivity of the oppressed. When collective action breaks the passivity, the foundations of the old order begin to tremble. Thus, organized collective action is not merely one strategy among many, it is the only force capable of confronting and dismantling the deep-rooted structures of capitalist domination. It transforms isolated grievances into a unified movement, turns scattered individuals into a conscious class, and channels diffuse frustration into revolutionary purpose. Only through organization, solidarity, and coordinated struggle can workers reclaim control over their labor, their institution, and their future, laying the groundwork for a society built on equality, dignity, and collective freedom. Comrades, the truth is unmistakable. The world you inhabit has been shaped by forces that thrive on your silence, your fragmentation, and your resignation. Yet each insight you have just confronted tears away another layer of illusion. You now see how capitalist power constructs your reality by controlling the conditions of life and molding consciousness to accept domination. You understand that although workers create all wealth, they remain alienated from its benefits, separated from their labor, from one another, and from their own human potential. You recognize that the ruling class maintains its dominance not through open force alone, but through hidden economic structures and ideological narrative designed to keep you obedient. And you know that liberation can only begin when workers awaken to their shared exploitation, unite across every division imposed upon them, and reclaim the collective strength that the system fears most. Above all, you grasp that no amount of individual effort can dismantle a system built on inequality only organized. Collective action rooted in solidarity, clarity, and courage can transform society at its foundation. The path ahead is not one of passive hope, but of conscious struggle. Every insight becomes a step toward freedom. Every act of solidarity a blow against the structure that confine you, every moment of unity a signal that the world can be remade. The ruling class has shaped your reality in secrecy, but now the veil is lifting. The power to reshape society does not lie in their hands, it lies in yours, in the collective force of millions who refuse to remain divided. The future belongs to those who labor, to those who resist, to those who dare to imagine a world where human life is valued above profit. Comrades, your chains exist only so long as you accept them. The moment you stand together, the moment you organize with purpose, the moment you recognize yourselves as the authors of history, the structures that dominate you will begin to fall. The struggle is yours, the transformation is yours, and the liberation of society begins. With you here now, determined to rise as one force capable of shaping a new reality.